So good evening everyone. Welcome to the session on ReactJS. So in today's webinar, we are actually going to get an understanding of what exactly is ReactJS. And so I hope that you will be having an interesting time understanding details about React and how exactly it works. So let's move forward now. So this is basically the agenda for today's webinar. First section talks about JavaScript. The second section talks about what exactly or why exactly ReactJS is useful. The third section focuses on what is ReactJS. The fourth section focuses on the virtual DOM, and the final section talks about the different applications using ReactJS. So let's now move ahead to the first section, that is JavaScript. So what exactly is JavaScript? So JavaScript is basically a programming language which is predominantly used for a client-side implementation. It initially started off as a tool or a technology for predominantly doing client-side validation. But as the time has progressed, now it has moved into a full-fledged technology language which can be used both for client-side as well as server-side implementation as well. Okay, so in generally what happens is we basically have a HTML which is predominantly used for defining the layouts, and then we have CSS which typically takes care of the styling part. JavaScript along with these two technologies, and it can also be used for performing operations and manipulations on the HTML and the CSS. So when it comes to web applications and browser implementations, JavaScript has a very strong role to play. It can also basically configure the way the content will look like, how exactly different type of events are going to be handled in the web application, and so on. So JavaScript is a pretty powerful language, and it has been in the usage for many years. Okay. And right now, the whole focus of JavaScript has shifted more from a client-side language to a more universal language. So what are the typically advantages of JavaScript and the related things? The first top area is efficiency. I think JavaScript as a technology has a lot of predefined patterns and functions which are automatically by default presented with the framework. So no matter which framework we use, we will already get some predefined functionalities in place which a developer can start using and start building applications. So this saves a lot of time for the developer, and he can actually create workable code and deliverable implementation very soon using JavaScript framework. So efficiency is a very critical aspect. The second aspect is the security. So whatever JavaScript framework we use, they will be coming with a lot of default security-based implementations, and also different modules which can be integrated with the basic application to build security. So when it comes to things like authentication, authorization, encryption, cryptography, digital signatures, and anything which we talk about, all these things are automatically available in majority of the JavaScript frameworks. And apart from that, many of the JavaScript frameworks are automatically or in general supported by an open source community. So developers keep on contributing here, and the individuals who are actually working on building new applications can reuse those functionalities and sort of apply the security related patterns into the application itself. The next part is basically the cost part. One of the most critical factor in any implementation is cost. So the whole focus on open source was basically to make sure that people can actually start using implementation without paying any type of funding at the very initial stage. And so most of the JavaScript frameworks are open source and typically available using Git or the open source repositories. So individuals can actually keep on downloading features and can start using them. Many of them are frequently updated, so you can try using new features very, very easily. And you don't have to spend any type of initial funding to buy these frameworks. And so from an overall costing perspective, this gives you a big advantage because many times one of the most critical factors is cost itself. From that perspective, I think JavaScript frameworks in general more or less are open source. And so this is a very good feature for programmers to actually start using it and actually using it more from a end-to-end implementation perspective as well. So let's first talk about Angular and Ember. So I think there is one question from Samir, and he wants to understand how exactly do Angular and Ember differ from each other. So we'll also try to address that question. So Angular and Ember in general are two client-side MVC frameworks. Predominantly the focus of both these frameworks was single-page applications. Okay, and so when you talk about single-page application, it is basically an approach in which in the very beginning of the application, a single page will be loaded, which will contain the home page, and then there will be different paths to access different parts of the application, which could be different templates showing you different visual representation. Traditionally, the web applications will actually involve a lot of requests going to the server after the initial page was loaded, and that will take a lot of time. But with the introduction of the single page application approach, the number of requests to the server got effectively reduced, and any such request in general being handled through Ajax. Okay, so from the end user perspective, this gave a very good advantage to the consumer. AngularJS and Amber, both of them support the client-side MVC approach. They were started by two different, groups of individuals. Angular was primarily started by the Google team, and Amber was started by the Amber team. Both of them have their own way of doing the client-side MVC. Amber in general is more of a framework which in terms can be considered as a more end-to-end solution of client-side MVC with all the typical approaches predefined. Angular is something more of a framework which also gives a certain amount of flexibility to the developer building the solutioning part of it. And in terms of the way these frameworks have turned up, I think Amber has been slow. Angular has been pretty fast. It started off with Angular 1 and then shifted to Angular 2, now to Angular 4. And the way the whole concept works is pretty different. Also from a learning curve perspective, I think Angular is something which you will be able to start building applications pretty quickly. But Amber, you will need some amount of time to understand the overall concept. So from that perspective, I think Angular is something which will work for you pretty fast. And I think that's been the way Angular's popularity increased. And now with a lot of contribution from the community and a lot of frequent releases, I think anyone who really is trying to use client-side MVC is pretty much focused on Angular. Now let's talk about React and Vue. So both of them are again slightly different. So they're more of a Vue-centric solutions. React is more of a library. Vue is still considered to be more of a framework on the Vue side. The React basically was inspired as a component-driven library, which basically was designed to solve a single purpose, that is for a developer to actually think about building user interfaces as components and then combining together to actually build large components here. And so that was a predominant focus. Vue actually first tried to use the same concept of component-based development, but then it also has certain other features like in terms of more seamless integration with HTML and the templates. Whereas React basically follows a different approach. So they have a concept of a JSX which combines HTML and JavaScript, and that's something which is being used. But both of them are centric to Vue-based implementations. Meteor is quite different. Meteor is a framework which is an end-to-end framework for mobile-based application development. And in turn, it actually combines technologies like Angular, Node.js, and MongoDB underneath to actually help developers to have an end-to-end framework solution which can build fast mobile applications. So here you don't have to really choose individual technologies at each layer. They're already part of Meteor. So it's a single solution for everything. So for people who are actually focusing more on mobile-based implementation and quick applications, definitely Meteor is a very good choice here. Okay. So now let's move forward and talk about why ReactJS is popular, why it is used. So ReactJS basically tried to introduce some very interesting concepts. So React in general is usually used with a state management tool. But the idea is that the way the view is going to be represented and the way the view will be changed is controlled through a certain process. Okay, so if you have three scenarios like initial data or real-time data or user input, all of them will basically go through some type of dispatch mechanism, which will in turn update the store. The store can be considered as a representation of the data or the state, and this change in the store or the state will be reflected in the view. So the view by itself is not able to control the way it can change. So it has to follow a certain process, okay, which typically is more towards the one-way data flow. And this whole process of one-way data flow and I would say updation in a certain manner only with certain restrictions has made React a pretty popular technology. Okay, so there are no unexpected changes. Testing is more accurate. These are some of the key advantages you get. But React has tried to solve all these different aspects and made the whole technology much better and better in terms of performance as well as the usage of the memory. So this is just a representation of the same diagram. So we can now move forward. So what is the main challenge with DOM manipulation? So DOM manipulation turns out to be very expensive. A DOM is something which actually represents the way the HTML looks like. Now, traditionally what was happening is that changes to the DOM were very expensive because you had to actually iterate to the entire DOM structure to make the model. And this has been a challenge throughout. Okay, so when you have large DOM structures, this basically means that it takes a huge amount of time. So traditionally, DOM manipulation has been a very expensive, I would say, problem for us. But React has tried to change that, and we'll try to understand how exactly it tries to change it. So in React, basically there is an additional, layer in between, which is termed as the virtual DOM. So this basically sits between the browser and the actual DOM. Whenever there is a change in the DOM structure, first the virtual DOM will try to understand what that change is, okay, and it will only apply the differential to the actual DOM. This approach has not been there in a lot of other technologies, but React is one of the first technologies to introduce this concept, which right now is being adopted by many other frameworks as well. And I think the example we just discussed was about Vue.js. Okay. So this basically means that the changes happen much faster. So your speed improves, your memory usage is lesser, and definitely you get much better performance. Okay. So now let's move forward. So what is ReactJS? So ReactJS is basically a front-end JavaScript library which was actually developed by Facebook. And it was basically used to develop interactive as well as mobile-based applications. Okay. And it basically follows more of a template-based structure, which in general is a combination of JavaScript and HTML, which basically helps it to define the overall layout of the HTML and also provide the JavaScript-based operations as well, which gives it a lot of power. So so obviously, as I said, they started from Facebook, but then as Facebook found more value into the overall technology of React, they actually moved this to the community, and now at this stage it is basically maintained by the open source community who keep on adding features to React. And a lot of people are also building components, and they are contributing, which new developers can actually adopt and use them for their own implementation as well. Okay, so let's move forward now. So what is ReactJS? So the first concept, as I said, was basically about the virtual DOM, which meant that any changes happening to the DOM structure will be determined using something called as a diff and patch algorithm. So diff and patch algorithm basically means that it first finds out what are the differences into the current DOM and the changes which are going to come in, and then it will apply the patch of only the changes into the real DOM, which means that the whole process of DOM updation will happen much faster. The second process is basically one-way binding. So as I was saying, that the changes into the view can happen only in a certain process. Okay. So basically what happens here is that there is an action basically which determines what is going to be the flow. Okay. Then you have something called as a state, which indicates that what is the current data representation and what is the possible future representation. Okay. And then you have something called as a dispatch action, which basically applies the action and the current state and determines the new state. So in terms of technologies like Redux, this is basically termed as a reducer. Okay. So, but what happens here is that the overall change to the state can only happen through this process and no other ways. Okay, which basically means that there cannot be unexpected changes to the state. And so the whole view changes are going to be following only this process, which basically means that since there are no unexpected changes, so you can ensure that if at all a problem occurs in the way the view works, then it will happen only in a certain stage of that process, which can easily be debugged and solved. So this also saves a lot of time in terms of the testing process. Okay. So one-way binding is one of the key advantages in React, which has meant that it has helped developers to control the view rendering, and the adoption of this technology has increased tremendously. Okay. And the third area is basically the server-side rendering. So one of the very important aspects in the JavaScript space is the initial render. Okay. So whenever the application is loaded, in many cases what happens is you want the representation to be driven from the server, and then the further rendering can be taken care at the client side end. Now the reason why it is important is because you can actually use a lot of server-side features. You can make use of technologies like caching, etc., to basically store the initial render into the cache, and then so whenever you make a request, it will just make a request either to the server side or the cache and render the data. So the initial load time of the rendering is immensely done faster, and this is basically handled from the server side end. So if you see in this diagram, we basically are showing a combination of browser, React, and Node.js is one of the JavaScript-based server-side technologies which can be used to define APIs and also to help in defining the overall layout from the server. So this is one of the key areas why ReactJS has been very popular in the recent times. Now let's move forward and let's try to again get an insight about the virtual DOM. Okay, so we've already discussed it. Let's quickly understand it. So in general, what happens is, so in the diagram you see a model, a view, and a DOM. So typically what happens, the model gives the data to the view, which in turn creates a DOM for it. Okay, so DOM is nothing but the structure, how the data will be laid out. Then in the second step, we basically now what happens is whenever the data is updated by the model, the view had to create a new DOM for it. So the DOM creation process had to happen multiple times, which meant that a lot of additional data structures were created and a lot of memory consumption was also getting impacted here. This obviously puts a heavy load on the view and makes processing slower. So I think one of the key goals of any UI-based application is to get a very good response time. And if you spend time in just the DOM manipulation or the DOM operation, then the user will basically be waiting for most of the time. And he's really going to get feeling that the application is running very, very slow, which ideally should not happen. Okay, so that's one of the key objectives of any web-based application. Okay, so with React, as we see that between the real DOM and the browser or the view, we basically have this virtual DOM which understands that how the DOM will be updated. So what happens here is that with React.js, when the model gives the data to the view, if the DOM is empty, React will create a DOM for it, and whenever the data gets updated, React will create a virtual DOM for it, compare it with the current DOM with the previous one, and only apply those changes which are in difference. Okay, so this basically means that the process happens much faster here. Okay, so as I said, once the changes are calculated, it will update the real DOM with only the elements that have actually changed. And this is basically happening through a process called as diff and patch algorithm. Diff basically is used to determine the differences, and patch is basically used to apply the changes to the real time for the only elements which are changed. Let's move forward now. ReactJS applications. So these are some of the organizations which have actually adopted. So we have companies like Facebook, and then Yahoo, Uber, Netflix, then New York Times, and many more. In fact, there are companies like Walmart and PayPal and so on. The reason why these companies adopted React was because they found a lot of value in helping the developer think about building the overall UI as a set of components. So this is one of the questions which had come up in terms of what is exactly is a component-based development, right? So component-based development basically means that whenever you think about implementation, you think about components. And here in React, we are thinking about components from a user interface perspective. Okay, so everything and anything in the UI representation will be built by using small components. Okay, so as a developer, you first think about components, you build them, and then you start building the UI using those components. One of the key advantages you get here is that they become reusable. As a developer, once you have created a component first time, you can use them for all the future UI implementation which you're going to build, which basically helps you tremendously in the reusability perspective. And that is one of the key focus areas of React and how it works. So a lot of these companies have actually adopted it because they found a lot of value in this approach, and it actually spent and sort of saved a lot of their development time. And in many cases where people are preferring to use an end-to-end JavaScript-based solution with technologies like Node.js, for example, React works pretty well with the whole concept of the server-side rendering, which we just talked about. So it helps speed up the overall application perspective, which makes all the applications much faster and quicker. Okay, so I think that has been the type of value React has added, and I think that's meant that different companies have already adopted. And in fact, they have also gone ahead and changed the existing technology stack which they had used in the past. Some of these companies had Java-based technology stacks, some had .NET and PHP and so on. And I think now all of them have moved to React. So I think that's the type of value it gives, and I think these companies have adopted it, and I think more and more companies are going to move forward as the time progresses. So that brings me to the end of today's webinar on ReactJS. I think we have tried to cover some of the key aspects of ReactJS, like what exactly is JavaScript, what are the different types of JavaScript frameworks possible, what exactly is ReactJS, why ReactJS has been popular, what is the concept of a virtual DOM, and then finally we talked about different companies which are actually using ReactJS based applications. Okay, So that's all from my side. So thanks everyone and have a nice day. Thank you. Bye.